The quiet where pain speaks there is a silence that exists between the first cry of suffering and the whisper of salvation. A space where words fail, prayers seem unanswered, and even faith trembles. It is a silence that humanity knows too. Well, every person, regardless of faith or creed, has stood in that space between despair and deliverance, asking, why must we suffer? In Christian thought, this silence is not empty. It is a sacred stillness, a divine pause where the human soul meets the mystery of God's presence amid pain. From the agony of Christ in Gethsemane to the countless hearts weeping in quiet rooms, the silence between suffering and salvation is the crucible of transformation. It is here, in this uneasy stillness, that the essence of human sorrow and divine compassion are interwoven. The question is not whether God speaks in our suffering, but whether we can learn to hear him in the silence. The human experience of suffering pain is the most intimate and universal of human experiences. It strips away pretense, reveals the truth of who we are, and tests the resilience of the human spirit. Physical agony may wound the body, but spiritual pain pierces deeper. It unsettles meaning, erodes certainty, and exposes the frailty of hope. In this space, we often feel abandoned. When the world grows quiet and prayers seem to vanish into the void, we wonder whether heaven has turned away. Yet even in Scripture, this feeling of divine distance is not foreign. The psalmist cries, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Words later echoed by Christ on the cross. This shared cry across time and faith tells us that suffering is not a failure of belief, but part of its essence. The silence of God does not signify his absence. It may, instead, be the stage upon which our faith learns to breathe without proof. The silence of God, absence or presence. The silence of God is perhaps one of the most haunting and misunderstood aspects of faith. In moments of despair, silence can feel like neglect. In moments of peace, it can feel like wisdom. Yet, from a theological perspective, divine silence is not indifference, it is invitation. Throughout Scripture, silence precedes revelation. Before creation, there was nothing but stillness. Before resurrection, there was the stillness of the tomb. Between pain and redemption, silence is where divine transformation occurs unseen. When Christ hung upon the cross, heaven was silent. No voice thundered from above, no angels descended to rescue him. Yet within that silence, the greatest act of love unfolded. The absence of intervention was itself a form of divine communication, a statement that redemption is not always about rescue, but about endurance and transcendence. The silence of God, then, is not the void of love, but its most mysterious form. Suffering as the pathway to empathy. If suffering isolates, it also unites. Those who have known pain often carry within them a deeper capacity for compassion. In this paradox lies one of the quiet miracles of the human condition, that through suffering, we learn to see others more clearly. The wounds we bear, emotional, spiritual, or physical, can become bridges rather than barriers. They remind us that all humanity shares the same fragile fabric of existence. In the words of theologian Henry Nouwen, wounded healers are those who, by confronting their own suffering, become instruments of healing for others. The silence between suffering and salvation thus becomes a shared language, an unspoken understanding between souls who have endured Compassion, then, is the divine echo within human silence, the modern noise that drowns the silency in today's world. Silence has become a rare and even uncomfortable companion. We fill every moment with sound, distraction, and motion, perhaps, to avoid hearing the questions that arise in stillness. Modern life has commodified spirituality into noise. Prayers become performances, and moments of quiet reflection are replaced by slogans and spectacle. In such a culture, the idea of listening for God in silence seems almost archaic. Yet, paradoxically, it is in this digital chaos that humanity hungers most for meaning. When suffering strikes through illness, loss, or disillusionment, no amount of distraction can soothe the ache. We are forced back into the sacred silence we had been avoiding, reminded that true healing begins not with noise, but with listening. Perhaps salvation has not disappeared from our lives. Perhaps we have simply become too loud to hear it. Christ's silence. The theology of the cross, the story of the crucifixion, is, at its heart, a story of silence. From the moment Jesus was arrested to his final breath, the Gospels portray a haunting stillness in his responses. Before Pilate, he speaks little. Before his accusers, he remains silent. Even on the cross, his few words are sparse but eternal. This silence was not weakness, it was revelation. It was the silence of one who understood that redemption was unfolding beyond the reach of words. Through silence, Christ embraced the fullness of human suffering, betrayal, humiliation, pain, and transformed it into the language of grace. The silence of the cross invites humanity to look beyond the surface of pain. It reminds us that divine love is not loud, not forceful, but steadfast and quiet. Salvation did not come through a thunderous act of power, but through the humble endurance of suffering. Finding God in the quiet of our own pain, the most profound spiritual discoveries often occur not in moments of joy, but in the depths of sorrow. When all distractions fall away and only pain remains, what is left is raw encounter between the soul and the divine. To find God in this silence is not to hear a voice or see a vision, but to sense an abiding presence that transcends understanding. It may be the small comfort of peace amid chaos, the sudden gentleness of another's touch, or the strength to continue when strength should be gone. Such moments do not erase suffering, but transform it. The silence becomes sacred, not because it ends pain, but because it reveals that pain is not the end. In the stillness, love remains. The role of faith communities, breaking the isolation of suffering while silence is sacred. Solitude need not be. The Church, at its best, is called to hold space for those who dwell in that silence, not to fill it with explanations or platitudes, but to accompany it with presence. Too often, faith communities rush to provide answers, quoting verses or promising quick redemption. Yet true ministry is not about solving pain, but sharing it. Sitting beside the suffering without words can be the most Christ-like act possible. When the Church learns to mirror the divine silence, compassionate, patient, and attentive, it becomes a vessel of genuine comfort. In this way, the body of believers becomes an embodiment of divine empathy, echoing God's presence through quiet solidarity. Silence as the language of heaven in mystical theology. Silence is not emptiness, but fullness, the purest form of communication with thee. Divine words, after all, can only point toward mystery. Silence allows us to enter it. The saints and mystics across centuries, from St. John of the Cross to Teresa of Avila, have all described a holy silence that transcends reason. It is in this silence, they say, that the soul encounters the infinite. Perhaps this is why suffering, which strips away all pretense, prepares us to enter that silence more fully. The cry of anguish becomes the doorway to communion, and the absence of sound becomes the presence of God, redemption through stillness salvation. In its deepest sense, is not the removal of pain, but the renewal of being. It is the transformation that occurs when suffering is met with faith rather than despair, when we sit in silence with our pain, not fleeing it, not numbing it. We open ourselves to grace. That grace does not always heal the wound, but changes the one who bears it. The silence between suffering and salvation thus becomes a sacred passage, a kind of spiritual alchemy through which anguish is turned into wisdom. In that space we learn what no sermon can teach, that love is stronger than suffering, and that even in the quietest darkness, God is still near. The holy interval, the silence between suffering and salvation, is not an empty void but the heartbeat of faith itself. It is where humanity learns the rhythm of divine patience, where hope survives, not through certainty, but through endurance. If the cross teaches anything, it is that silence does not mean absence. Between the agony of Good Friday and the glory of Easter morning lies Holy Saturday, the quiet, uncelebrated day of waiting. And it is in that day, in that silence, that humanity lives most of its life, between pain and promise, sorrow and redemption. To dwell in that silence is not to be forgotten by God, but to be invited into His most intimate mystery, the mystery of a love that suffers with us and transforms our pain into resurrection.